Thank you very much, Ted, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to the committee. Initially, I'd been involved in research in this area for nearly 10 years, but in 2016, did an international survey of 20 countries, and basically we looked at product information on parenteral cytotoxic and monoclonal antibodies used in cancer. It was quite a detailed study, but what we looked at was the range of vial sizes, overage stability data, etc. But the results of that study showed that the vial sizes internationally varied widely, and a lot of countries only had one size available to them. Stability data was very inconsistent and usually was only 24 hours, and there were many medications suitable for cost reduction strategies. Now, from that study, we published another commentary which looked at ways that we may be able to improve that drug wastage. And one of the things was that if a certain range of drugs vial sizes were available in one country, we couldn't see why that the same vial sizes could not be available in all countries that drugs are used. We also felt there was a need to encourage legislation in various countries to enable the practice of vial sharing, and also that there needed to be accreditation for facilities that were manufacturing the drugs so they could do this safely and effectively. You already know about dose rounding and dose banding. I won't go on to talk about overage, but one of the big issues that I feel is important is the availability of good stability data on products once they've been manufactured. And that research should be part of pharmaceutical industry R&D. They spend billions of dollars looking at all sorts of things, but they don't do any decent stability data, and that's quite cheap to do. In terms of vial sizes, there was a paper published by Hatzwell and Porter last year that actually looked at population modelling to try and work out the correct vial size volumes to choose when the manufacturers were producing products. So they looked at patient populations and they considered the distribution of various characteristics such as gender, because sometimes you see diseases are more common in females than males. They also looked at geographical location. For example, if you've got a patient in Vietnam, they're going to be different body sizes from someone, say, in the USA. They also looked at when you're manufacturing vials, that it should be cost effective and easy to manufacture, and also the doses that are chosen should be not too complex, so there's not the risk of any errors in calculations. And one interesting things they did find was that when there was a larger vial size and they made another smaller size and they were perfectly, the smaller size was perfectly divisible into the larger size, wastage was markedly higher. In Australia, we are lucky in that we can use vial sharing because our number of organisations have made that possible. The TGA is basically the same as your FDA, and they've got guidelines for the use of partial vials. The Pharmacy Board of Australia is involved in the registration of pharmacists and a number of other issues, and they also provide guidelines on what's called beyond use dating. So allowing extended dating periods, particularly with the use of closed system transfer devices, to extend the time we can actually use vials. And the Society of Hospital Pharmacists of Australia also support vial sharing, and they've listed a number of things that we need, and that's things like specialised aseptic pharmacy facilities and licensed compounding facilities. So if you meet these guidelines and follow rigorous frameworks for governance and professional standards, then you have the ability to produce products via vial sharing. Probably our biggest benefit over America and a number of other countries is the way we provide drugs. And we have the thing called the Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme. Now, all drugs used in Australia need to be registered by the TGA, but pharmaceutical companies then can apply to the PBS to receive government subsidies for their products, and their applications need to be based on efficacy data and safety data, but also provide pharmacoeconomic evaluations. Once the drug's approved, they go into a negotiation period as to what amount of money the government is prepared to pay for their product. So therefore, this funding is available, and the subsidy is available to both public and private patients alike, and to public and private hospitals. And we also have a PBS scheme called the Efficient Funding of Chemotherapy. And their goal is to minimise waste and reduce costs by funding the amount of drug that is from the lowest combination of vials needed to make that product. Sometimes we have a patient co-contribution, and whether a drug is actually put on the PBS depends on a number of set criteria, included the various drugs available and also the diagnosis and indication that it is for, and that changes the quantity that they're able to subsidise. There's been I've only looked at some international research from the last 12 months. There was a very good paper published in Australia that looked at MABs prepared at a major teaching hospital in Melbourne over a 2-year period. And they used one of the closed system transfers devices called PharSeal, and they were able to extend beyond use dating to up to 7 days. So this study was based on them only using the largest size vial and instituting vial sharing. And they, comparing with what individual doses would have been needed for the same dose, using the minimum number of vials to achieve that. And they showed a yearly cost saving of over $350,000 US. I won't go into the other studies. The main difference with them is Albania only used one drug, whereas India didn't look at monoclonal antibodies, and monoclonal antibodies are where your big savings are because they're so expensive. How you apply vial sharing can change. You've heard of dose rounding already from some of your other presenters, but if you round the dose up, you don't necessarily make any savings on leftover drugs because you're just using that drug for the patient and not actually saving it. But one thing that dose rounding can do, it can facilitate the recycling of already prepared products, because if the patient isn't treated with that drug and it could potentially go to waste, it makes it easier to use in another patient. Drug days is when you actually try and get people on a very expensive but not commonly used drug to be treated on the same day in the same clinic. And that allows vial sharing by increasing the number of doses you're basically making in a day. And there's been a study was done in Italy using ipilimumab, which can be up to like $30,000 US a dose. And in the centres that actually employed these drug days, they saved over nearly, over $8,000 per patient per dose with ipilimumab. With a group of international experts, plus myself, who's not an expert in this area, I don't profess to be a manufacturing pharmacist, but we looked at closed system transfer devices, and basically the area of the device we were interested in is their ability to prevent bacteria or other matter getting into the system during compounding, and thus ensuring the stability of the product. That then allows you to employ vial sharing techniques by extending the beyond use dating. There's been numerous published studies using one particular brand called PharSeal. There's a lot of other brands available, but they just don't have the data behind them. So most people that do the studies have been using PharSeal. And one of the things that they test is a thing called microbial ingress, which when you're using unpreserved vials, you need to be able to evaluate the ability of the closed system transfer device to resist or inhibit the transfer of any type of infectious microorganism. But that needs to be done under simulated use conditions. So, multiple punctures, multiple uses of that vial with the device intact. So that's been a proven cost-saving initiative. In Australians, we use things called compounding companies. So they're basically a business. And we use that in my hospital. I'm situated about 130 kilometres west of Brisbane, which is our capital city. And they have 2 companies that work out of Brisbane that make our chemotherapy for us. So we order those drugs the day before. They're delivered by 7 o'clock the next morning. And they're able to use vial sharing techniques. And by doing that, we get charged on a per milligram basis for our drugs rather than on a per vial basis, which saves an enormous amount of money. So there's some recommendations that we've come up with that need to be possibly instituted to make this work. So we need to have legislation available in countries to allow vial sharing to happen. Unfortunately, that is not the case. There needs to be formal testing procedures to ensure that microbial ingress has been performed on all vials, and these have been validated and standardised. So these CSTDs are actually accredited to extend beyond use dating. And they need to also know the length of the time the vials can be classified as sterile following connection to the device, and that needs to be stipulated for all brands. And we also need to look at what sort of conditions the vials that are attached to the CTSD need to be kept in to enable that to go on the beyond use dating, whether they need to be kept in particular temperature like refrigeration, or whether they need to be kept in an ISO 5 environment to ensure the sterility. And also all brands need, and that's the bottom reference I've cited. And when I listened to one of your experts from industry present in your previous session, they were worried about things like containment integrity, coring, and having a hold-up volume where there's volume in the device that risks you're not getting enough drug into the actual product you're comparing. So that needs to be considered as well. One of my big areas that I'm very passionate about is stability. If you're just making a compounded product and using the information in the product information the company's provided, you only have a very short expiry because the data is just not there. However, the pharmaceutical industries have done this because they only generally look at a 24-hour expiry because that's all they need for registration of the products. They don't need to worry about anything further. However, if you look at the published research, many drugs have a much longer stability, and there's data out there for rituximab, trastuzumab that extends to 6 months. The compounding companies actually do their own in-house studies. So that's, obviously only available to them, but it enables us to use their products for a much longer period of time. And the companies have different data. So when I'm purchasing, I actually will use the stability data to drive which company I deal with for a particular product, because we have contract systems. So both companies charge basically the same amount of money because there's a Queensland government contract for that product within our state. So that what that does do, if you actually somehow can empower the pharmaceutical industry to include drug development in their drug development programs, decent stability studies, and make those available to pharmacies, we can have a much more flexible approach to how we deal with file sharing and how long we can make the products once prepared last. We did a study we published last year, my regional cancer centre, and just to give you a bit of background, I'm in sort of the southeastern part of Queensland, which is in the northern part of Australia, and we cover an area, like our catchment area is the size of Spain or the size of Texas. So it's massive. So it's very, very important to us that we can have our drugs with a decent stability data, because our patients can travel miles and miles to get to us. So we looked at products we'd purchased over a 6-month period from external compounding companies which had extended stability. And we found that 12% of the drugs that we had ordered had to be orphaned. And by orphaned, I mean they had to be, patients had to be delayed, whether for some sort of toxicity, or sometimes they just don't turn up. Or you might have found that the patient had progressive disease and they were just ceased from therapy. So we were left with those products. So we were able to reuse nearly 87% of those products in either the same patient if they've been delayed, say they're delayed a week. If we'd made that product, we would have had to throw it out within 24 hours, but because we bought this with extended stability, we could use that at the time frame the patient was delayed. But we could also use them in other patients on the same dose. So we actually saved 91% of our budget on wasted products. So we were able to save that money that otherwise would have been wasted. And that was nearly 10% of our overall expenditure on cancer drugs, and equated to over $200,000 US over a 6-month period. That's just to give you a bit of a look at the products that we get. Obviously, blank the name out of the product, but nivolumab now is a set dose product in most situations, and we can get up to 6 weeks expiry data. I tried to contact a number of colleagues around the world to give you an international feel for what's going on. It was very hard to get data from people, and I did get some information I've included on this slide. New Zealand and Australia and the United Kingdom, very similar to Australia. They have a similar system to our PBS. You already know the United Kingdom is very good with national dose banding strategies. They have tables. New Zealand, like us, use compounding companies and vial sharing. They don't have any information on the assigning a physical value to unused waste. In Canada, they follow basically the American systems, but they do some vial sharing in larger sites with accredited facilities. They do use drug days, and also they do have a wastage account to assign a value on the drug that's not used. Kenya is quite interesting in itself. They're a very small country. They have a government-funded insurance scheme, but that's capped, so they only fund up to a certain amount of the treatment costs involved. My colleague in Nairobi felt that things were going to get worse because their treatment strategies are becoming more decentralised. Plus, that limits the number of patients they could potentially share vials with at each centre, and also that they don't have the same ability to get the drugs that we do. In terms of whether the situation will become worse, everyone agrees that it's going to become worse. Drugs are becoming more expensive. Many more new drugs are becoming available. Every time you pick up, look at a journal like JCO or New England Journal, there's a new drug trial being published. And we're also getting an increasing number of indications for these drugs, particularly the new biologicals and immunotherapies. And we're also getting increasing patient numbers. So I think everybody expects this situation is going to be much worse. Where the global advantages of drug sharing lie are obviously billions of dollars in savings. That's not only in the US, because the US has a huge influence over practice in the rest of the world. So it's global savings of billions and billions of dollars. You already know from previous presenters that it's a way of managing drug shortages. But one of the other big advantages in the environmental savings that can happen, because you use vial sharing, you can decrease the volume of waste produced with cytotoxic drugs and biological agents. And there's also savings on disposal of that waste. They've got to be sent away for high temperature incineration at specialist facilities, and you have to pay for that. So in conclusion, I was very pleased to hear in one of the presentations that the United States Pharmacopoeia looking at standard 797 with single dose vials and trying to extend the current 6-hour time frame that you have to use those products. I think that'll be a massive advantage around the world because a lot of countries actually adopt the US standards in that regard. So if you change that, it makes it a lot easier to do vial sharing. Your FDA, again, they have a lot of power because decisions on drug registrations that they make influence other countries. In the last couple of years, Australia has been paying a lot more attention to what the FDA do because they were looking at a way to get drug registrations through a lot quicker than was currently happening in Australia. So we look at a lot of the information that FDA decides, and we're registering cancer drugs particularly a lot quicker. Therefore, they have massive power. The pharmaceutical industry, just some suggestions. We don't have many preserved multi-vial doses available. We don't have them in Australia. I know there's a trastuzumab product available internationally. They also have the ability, as I've said quite a few times, to provide extended stability data. And they also need to possibly look at population modelling when they're determining what sort of vial sizes they do produce. I'm very pleased that you asked me to be part of this study because your recommendations have massive international ramifications. I'm hoping that what you decide can flow through to the rest of the world, and particularly that I don't know whether this will happen because I know the United States situation is very unique, but it would be wonderful if you had the power to influence drug companies to make some changes, to make drugs less expensive and make these processes that we've developed to reduce expenditure much easier to achieve. Mm-hmm. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Gilbar. We really appreciate the presentation. Francis, I'm going to go into questions now. People should raise their hand electronically if they wish to. How much time do we have for questions?
I think we can do about 8 minutes now.
8 minutes, okay. So with that in mind, keep your questions short but targeted, and let's go ahead and start. You can stop sharing the screen now, and we'll proceed. Jonathan, this is your area. Did you want to start?
Just one. I think a lot of the discussion around file sharing that I've seen is around the closed system transfer devices. But what about if they are in an ISO 5 hood and they are it is following the 6 hours or less that from USP 797 compliant? Are they also using file sharing strategies that you're aware of in Australia or elsewhere effectively? So even without the CSTD, is file sharing being done in a meaningful way?
It's very hard for me to speak because Australia's practice is quite diverse. I know in the most centres that are doing it are using closed system transfer devices, and I think that's become pretty much common practice. Within the compounding companies, they basically use the devices. They only do it on the day that they're making, but they have the ability to have enough drugs coming through that they can, just do the period of time that they manufacture, which should be less than 12 hours. Some of the biggest centres in that study that I quoted from Melbourne, they're using extended beyond use dating. Unfortunately, we do very small, limited number of manufacturing in my site. We purchase 95% of our drugs from external companies.
Tina Shi, you had one?
Yes. Thank you very much for very informative presentation. So can you talk a little bit about reimbursements for those infused drug? I think in one of your paper you mentioned it was by milligram instead of like fixed dose like the US.
Yes, it can be both. We purchase them if we buy through a compounded company. If it's a drug that's very commonly used and they can employ vial sharing, they will only charge us on a per milligram basis. So if we have a drug that, you might have a 100 milligram vial and it's a very common drug and we only want 75 milligrams, if they use vial sharing, we'll be charged for 75 milligrams and therefore make a saving. Then when we apply for reimbursement from the PBS, we will only apply for that 75 milligrams. So that saves the government sort of money on that regard. If it's a product that's not commonly used, the federal government under their efficient funding of chemotherapy program will pay for the smallest number of vial sizes to make that product. So if it's a 75 milligram dose and we only have a 100 milligram vial, we would get paid for 100 milligram. Does that explain?
Yes, thank you. Very helpful.
And Peter, did that motivate anyone to start using a closed system transfer device, or did they already have that process before they moved to the milligram?
A lot of hospitals already had that process in place. And one thing we do, I did present our recycling study, and in that regard, we don't double dip. So because what we do is if the patient, we actually apply for the patient the drug was originally ordered from. So if we end up using it in another patient, we don't recharge the government for the second patient. You only ever charge them once. The government only gets charged once, but we just use the recycling to save. It's basically saving money, not particularly for my hospital, but it's saving money for the Commonwealth of Australia.
I believe, Robin, you're next.
Great. While I'm trying to figure out this video business, I want to thank you for a really interesting talk, and I also really enjoyed reading your papers. And so one question I had about the paper that showed the variation in vial size availability across country is if you had that information for the US, compared to other countries. So I know that there were some drugs, both cytotoxic and also monoclonal antibodies, that had multiple vial sizes available, and some countries that did not. And I'm wondering how the US fares compared to some of those other countries. So for example, is the US consistently have only one vial size compared to some of the other countries? Or maybe you can comment to that.
Probably the most difficult part of commenting on that is that was a snapshot done in 2016, and things have changed.
Right.
So I know that in the US, possibly some of the vial sizes have increased in that period of time. So yeah, it's a bit difficult. I think what we were trying to do in that study was just show the discrepancies that could occur rather than be particular for a certain area. The United States was very good in that they did have the majority of the products that we looked at. But I've got the paper here, but it's probably pointless me trying to look at it because, again, 4 years on, things have changed so much to know what vial sizes you do currently have. The companies are often very loath to change practices because it often means they've got to pay extra money, because certainly in Australia, if you submit more data and you change your product information, there's a fee involved in Australia to do that, and it may be very similar in the United States. So the companies don't tend to do it. They're trying to save money all the time. They've got their taxpayers to answer to, so they're trying to make money for everybody. So they're very loath to do things they don't have to do. Now, that's why I was wondering whether in the United States, just because your sheer power and sheer influence on the way things are done globally, whether things like the FDA have actually power to dictate to the pharmaceutical industry. I don't even know. I assume that they have lobbyists, the same they do with the tobacco industry and all those other things, that it becomes much more political in America than it does in Australia. I could be very naive, but
I think that's a safe assumption.
Good assumption.
Surely not. Surely not.
All right. Alistair, you next, I think.
Hey, thanks. This was very useful. I have two or three sort of clarification questions. If I understand you correctly, I think what you're describing, at least in Queensland, is a kind of just-in-time delivery system where the manufacturing, or at least the preparation of the drug product, is being carried out somewhat centrally, at least by the suppliers who are doing it, and then delivering that to the hospitals. Is that right?
yeah, not all the hospitals in Queensland actually use this system, because a lot of the major hospitals have their own accredited manufacturing facilities. So the big hospitals in Brisbane do a lot of their own manufacturing, whereas the smaller hospitals and the regional hospitals tend to use these a lot more. And pretty much they're based in Brisbane, so places like Cairns, that is 1,500, 1,600 kilometres north, can actually get their drug orders in the day before and get them delivered the next day, because the flights going to Cairns can deliver that quickly. And so it's a huge advantage. We have to have extended stability just for that delivery time anyway. Like, you can't order a drug that has less than 24 hours stability in these systems. And so we actually make some drugs that have got very poor stability data. But the majority of our products, we get decent stability, and it can be up to, 3 months. So it gives us a lot of time if patients are delayed or whatever to reuse those drugs. It just makes it a very cost-effective system. And from what I can understand, you don't have these companies in the USA.
Well, we sort of do, but not entirely. We had a disaster in the US, I guess, 3 or 4 years ago now, maybe more than that, Jonathan, where with compounding facilities. But I'm trying to draw out from you, I like the sound of that as a central provision. Do you think that's been a success for you?
It's been a massive success. Yes,
right.
It's just allowed us so much more flexibility, and it's allowed patients to be treated closer to home. We have some regional sites further west than us. We can actually do some safe sort of chemotherapy at, and we do a lot of online video conferencing to some of these sites, but it's limited in the type of drug we can use. Things that.
Right. So given that that's being manufactured off-site, as it were, centrally, and that you don't charge for the excess use, how do you avoid misappropriation in that setting?
Well, we actually only get charged for what we buy, and that is what we claim from the government.
No, but supposing I'm running a manufacturing site in a distal city, and you call up and say you're ordering a drug that takes 8 mils of a 10 mil vial. I'm left with 2 mils of that, and I use that to send to a different city, to make another dose. How do you avoid fraud in that process? Because presumably are these commercial organizations?
Yeah, they're commercial companies. But what they're doing is when they charge us, like if we order 73 milligrams of something, we actually have a statewide tender system within Queensland Health, but they use the same sort of pricing for public hospitals as well. So we only get charged that we have a list of fees, what they charge. So it might be, $5 per milligram for that particular drug. So we get charged for the actual milligram amount we use. So they're actually, that's the way they can avoid that problem, only by charging for the milligram. You only ever actually pay for that with the vial sharing. For drugs, they can't vial share, then they charge you for full vials.
No, but and the milligrams that are left, I understood.
They use that in another product, but then the next person is still only paying for milligrams. So you're not actually cheating. It's always based on a milligram basis, and that's what you charge for. So if they vial share, the next person that used part of that vial is still only charged for milligrams that they actually order. So you can't actually, there's not really a chance of fraud in that.
Now, and one of the issues in the US, one of the reasons that's at least put forward that the US doesn't have data on stability, or manufacturers don't want to get stability data, is they don't want to assume the liability risk. And is it fair to say that's less of a problem in Australia than it would be in the US?
Well, the companies aren't doing it in Australia either. So
no. Right, but they don't. The problem, the fear is that if they get stability data that went out, say, for a week, and something happened, they would be responsible for the disaster because they'd said it would be fine for a week. Whereas under the system you're describing, I guess the guy who does the manufacturing has actually come up with the stability data and would assume whatever liability risk there was.
I assume that's correct. It's I haven't heard that argument before. I suppose it's feasible, but we're not the same litigious society that the USA is. So
yeah, that's for sure. Right.